The winds that swept through Ash Creek Valley carried with them the scent of dust, cedarwood, and unspoken tensions that stretched back generations. It was a valley shaped by storms and hardened by sun, carved with trails that only the bravest dared ride. And on one quiet dawn, when the first light filtered over the ridges like the opening of some sacred curtain, a lone rider crossed its threshold. His silhouette rose against the fiery sky, tall in the saddle, weathered by distance and longing. Every hoof beat of his roan stallion echoed the weight of his purpose. He had returned to claim the future he once walked away from. His name was Mason Hart, though most of the valley only remembered him as the drifter who disappeared 5 years earlier, leaving behind a whisper of a promise and the girl whose heart he had taken without meaning to. Time had carved its marks upon him, deepening the shadows in his eyes and broadening the tired set of his shoulders, but nothing had shaken loose the one reason he ever cared for the valley. Memory of the youngest daughter of the Rowan family, Ilara, whose quiet strength had captured him long before he was brave enough to admit it. Yet Mason did not ride back simply for romance or some wild notion of settling down. He returned because he had received a letter, one written in a trembling hand, carried through 2 border towns, and stained at the edges by the dust of the desert. The letter had spoken of danger, of threats rising against the Rowan homestead, of a sacred law older than the valley itself, a tradition guarded fiercely by Ilara's older sisters. They had waited years, watching, testing, shielding their youngest with a loyalty that bordered on ferocity. And now, if Mason wished to stand at Ilara's side, he would first have to prove his worth to them through trials few men had survived. The valley itself seemed to challenge him as he rode deeper into its embrace. The sun rose higher, revealing familiar pathways, the twisting creek that wound between cottonwoods, the ridge where hawks circled in the thermals, the abandoned mill where rusted iron groaned in the morning wind. Every sight carried a memory, both cherished and painful. Mason had been young when he left, driven by uncertainty and the belief that he needed to carve out his own identity before he could ever claim a future with someone else. But he had learned that distance did not quiet longing. It only amplified what truly mattered. By midday, the Hart rider reached the outer boundary of the Rowan lands. Tall fencing lined the rolling hills, and the sound of livestock drifted faintly through the breeze. The Rowan homestead had always been a symbol of resilience, a fortress of timber and stone built by a family whose roots sank deep into the valley's history. Yet something felt different now. There was a heaviness in the air, a tension that suggested the land itself was bracing for a storm. As Mason dismounted near the main gate, his gloved hand brushed the carved emblem on the post, a circle flanked by 3 feathers. The mark of the Rowan sisters. Each feather represented one of the women who guarded the family's sacred law. Amara, the eldest, whose steadiness held the family together. Lydia, the second, born, whose sharp instincts protected them from threats before they even reached the horizon. And Rowan's youngest, Ilara, represented by the feather carved within the circle. Together, the emblem announced that no outsider could enter without approval, and no man could seek the hand of the youngest sister without facing the trials set by the others. Mason knew this well. 5 years earlier, he had been offered the chance to face the trials, but he had not been ready. Fear, immaturity, and the weight of expectations had driven him away. Now, he hoped he had returned in time to prove he was no longer the boy who fled. The sound of hooves on hardened earth drew Mason's attention. 3 horses approached from the east pasture, moving with purpose. Their riders were unmistakable. Amara's steady posture, Lydia's alert gaze, and Ilara beside them, smaller in frame but radiant with the quiet strength that had once brought Mason to his knees. Without a single word spoken, the sisters dismounted with practiced precision. The air seemed to hold its breath as they approached, boots sinking into dust, coats fluttering slightly in the rising wind. Mason stood tall, though the weight of their presence pressed against him like the heat of mid-day sun. He could feel the years stretching between them, weaving memories with uncertainty. He knew the sacred law demanded silence at moments like this. No words could be exchanged until intentions were declared through action. Amara observed him first, her gaze steady and unreadable. Lydia circled slightly, assessing, measuring who he had become. And Ilara, her eyes held the soft ache of recognition, mixed with something deeper, something unspoken and fragile. Mason felt the distance between them like a canyon carved by time. If he was to earn the right to stand beside her again, he would need to prove himself worthy, not through promises or declarations, but by facing trials shaped by the strengths and expectations of the Rowan lineage. These trials would test his loyalty, his endurance, and the truth of his heart. Only when the sisters were satisfied, only when the sacred law recognized him, could the path toward Ilara be opened. The wind swept across the valley, swirling dust around their feet. The eldest sister lifted her hand, marking the beginning of a challenge older than any of them. It was the moment Mason had anticipated and feared in equal measure. The moment he would learn whether the man he had become was enough to claim the future he had abandoned years ago. The Rowan sisters studied him a moment longer before turning toward the homestead, silently instructing him to follow. The trials would not begin today. Tradition required preparation. But by crossing the boundary of their land, Mason had already taken the first step into a reckoning that would test every piece of him. And deep within him, beneath layers of fear, regret, and longing, burned a certainty stronger than ever. He would face whatever trials they placed before him, not out of obligation, but out of love for the woman he had left behind. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the valley, Mason walked behind the sisters toward the place where his fate would soon be decided. He did not know what dangers lay ahead, nor how long the trials would last. He only knew that the Rowan sacred law was absolute, and in the wild heart of the West, love was a prize earned through courage, not claimed through desire. The homestead door opened, and with it, the beginning of a journey that would shape every chapter of his future. And so, with dusk settling upon Ash Creek Valley, the stage was set for the trials to come. The morning sun rose over Ash Creek Valley with a quiet solemnity, as though the land itself understood the weight of traditions being awakened. Its golden light spilled across the Rowan homestead, stretching long shadows of fencing, barns, and weather-beaten cabins across the dusty yard. Inside those structures lived the stories of generations who had upheld the sacred law, a code older than the valley's first settlers, passed down through the Rowan women like a flame that resisted even the fiercest winds. Mason Hart felt the heaviness of that legacy before he even stepped out of the small bunkhouse they had offered him for the night. The room had been bare, just a cot, a wooden table, and a small wash basin, but it was more than he deserved after years of absence. He had spent much of the night awake, listening to the distant calls of coyotes and the restless shifting of the ranch's horses. But more than anything, he listened to the land itself, as if the valley were whispering warnings about the trials to come. He stepped outside at dawn, breath condensing in the cool morning air. The homestead lay quiet, though not asleep. The Rowan sisters were known to greet the sun long before the rest of the valley rose. Beyond the barn, smoke curled from a small fire pit, a sign that preparations were already underway. Everything about the property, the worn fences, the iron tools hanging beside the stable doors, the lines of boot prints etched deep into the soil, spoke of discipline, order, and purpose. Mason knew he had returned to a place that demanded more from him than he had ever given before. He walked toward the main structure of the homestead, his boots kicking up soft clouds of dust. The house stood firm against the landscape, built from thick timber and stone that had weathered decades of storms. It bore the same carved emblem he had seen at the front gate, the circle and 3 feathers that marked the Rowan lineage. But here, the carving was deeper, older, and more intricately detailed. The edges were softened by time, yet the meaning remained sharp as ever. To step across this threshold with intentions toward the youngest sister was to accept the sacred law in its entirety. Mason paused before entering, aware that the moment he crossed the doorway, the trials would officially begin. The interior of the main hall greeted him with the scent of cedar smoke and herbs. The walls were covered with framed relics, old rifles, tools, woven patterns, and symbols that represented the family's history. Each relic told a story of hardship and resilience. Mason felt himself shrinking beneath the weight of those silent witnesses, as though they had gathered to judge the man who dared return after abandoning the valley. At the far end of the hall stood a large wooden table, and behind it the Rowan sisters. Amara, the eldest, stood with her hands resting firmly against the surface, her posture steady and unyielding. Lydia remained beside her, sharp-eyed and thoughtful, her presence quiet but powerful. And then there was Ilara, the youngest, framed by the soft glow of the rising sun that poured through the window behind her. Her presence softened the severity of the room, but it did nothing to ease the tension that hung in the air. Mason felt the gravity of their stances before he fully met their gazes. The Rowan sisters were unified 3 forces woven by blood, history, and the protective instinct that defined their lineage. And though no words were spoken, he understood the message they conveyed. He had returned to fight for a place he had once walked away from. A long silence filled the hall as the sisters assessed him, each searching for the truth behind the man he had become. He felt their scrutiny as a physical weight, pressing into the scars of his past and the hopes he carried for the future. Then, with a slow and deliberate movement, Amara lifted a small wooden box from the table and opened it. Inside lay 3 feathers, 1 black, 1 brown, and 1 white, each bound with red thread, the feathers of trial. The sacred law required that any man seeking to marry the youngest Rowan sister must complete a journey shaped by each of the feathers. The black feather represented endurance and resilience, tested through survival in the valley's harsh wilderness. The brown feather symbolized loyalty, measured by defending the Rowan homestead against threats both seen and unseen. The white feather stood for truth, demanding a confrontation with one's past and the courage to reveal one's heart without disguise. The trials were not tests of brute strength. They were tributes to the values the Rowan women lived by, reminders that love was not merely emotion, but commitment forged through hardship and clarity. Amara held the feathers with reverence. Lydia observed Mason's reactions with piercing intensity. And Ilara, her gaze softened only slightly, but enough for Mason to feel the faint spark of the bond they once shared. Amara placed the feathers on the table. Lydia adjusted them into a straight line, as tradition demanded. And without a single spoken word, the trials began. It started with the black feather. Mason followed the sisters outside into the bright morning light. Beyond the homestead stretched miles of rugged land, untamed forest, rocky cliffs, winding rivers, and hidden ravines. The Rowan trial of endurance required the challenger to enter the wilderness alone, surviving with only what the sisters allowed him to carry. No maps, no assistance, no guarantees. He would be expected to navigate the land using instinct and skill, confronting whatever dangers the valley presented. Immerse handed him a leather satchel. Inside, he found only essentials: a knife, a flint stone, a coil of rope, and a canteen of water. Lydia secured the satchel across his chest, ensuring it was fastened tightly. Ilara stepped forward last, offering the black feather itself. Her hand brushed his as she placed it into his palm, a fleeting contact, yet powerful enough to stir every dormant emotion he had tried to suppress over the years. By accepting the feather, Mason sealed his commitment to the first trial. He turned toward the wilderness, feeling the eyes of the Rowan sisters upon him. The forest loomed ahead, its dense canopy whispering reminders of the valley's dangers: wolves that roamed in hungry silence, cliffs that crumbled without warning, storms that rose without mercy. The land was beautiful but unforgiving. Many men had attempted this trial, only a few had succeeded. As Mason stepped forward, he felt the familiar tug of uncertainty. He had survived brutal landscapes before, but this trial was different. It was not his life he feared losing, it was the future he sought to reclaim. The valley swallowed him slowly as he moved deeper into the trees. Sunlight flickered through the leaves, casting shifting patterns on the ground. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of branches, the distant howl carried on the wind, felt magnified. The wilderness was testing him already, prodding, waiting, watching. Hours passed as Mason trekked through dense thickets, crossed shallow streams, and climbed towering slopes. He moved steadily, conserving energy and remaining alert. The land offered beauty in fleeting glimpses: a deer darting through the trees, the glimmer of sunlight across a hidden pond. But beneath it all pulsed a quiet threat. The valley never allowed comfort, only awareness. As dusk approached, Mason found a small clearing near a rocky outcrop and prepared a temporary camp. He gathered fallen branches, sparked a fire with his flint stone, and rested against the base of a large oak tree. The black feather rested beside him, a reminder that this was only the beginning. Night settled over Ash Creek Valley like a dark, watchful guardian. The fire crackled softly, its warmth barely holding back the cold. Mason remained awake for hours, listening to the shifting life of the forest around him. He had faced danger before, but the subtle tension that filled the air now felt different, calculated, almost purposeful. The valley was testing him, the sacred law was watching, and the Rowan sisters were waiting to see whether he would endure the darkness long enough to earn the dawn. The wilderness of Ash Creek Valley changed its nature at night, shifting from a rugged expanse of dusty trails and whispering pines into a living, breathing presence that observed every intruder with suspicion. As the last embers of Mason's small fire dimmed beneath the weight of drifting ash, he felt the valley awaken into its nocturnal self. It came alive, not with motion, but with a chilling stillness that seeped into the bones and hollowed the spirit. Mason Hart knew that surviving the black feather trial required endurance, but he had underestimated the psychological warfare of silence. The forest around him was too quiet, as though the creatures hiding within it avoided not only him, but something else roaming the night. The darkness pressed inward like an unbroken sheet, punctuated only by the faint glow of stars peeking through breaks in the canopy. The valley felt older here, untouched by the boots of travelers or the stakes of settlers. It was raw, unpredictable land that measured a man not by his strength, but by his spirit. Mason leaned back against the massive oak that sheltered his camp and listened. Every breath he took stirred the quiet, the sound muffled by the thick air. He could sense eyes watching him from beyond the firelight, yet no creature revealed itself. The hairs on the back of his neck rose, not from fear, but from the certainty that the valley was testing him more subtly than any wild beast could. The first true challenge came long before dawn. A faint tremor crossed the ground, barely perceptible, like the shift of a distant weight. Mason felt it through the soles of his boots. Then came another, slightly stronger. He rose to his feet, his body tensing as instincts honed by years of travel awakened. The forest did not tremble unless something large moved through it. The tremors grew heavier, pulsing through the soil in slow intervals. Only one creature in Ash Creek Valley moved with that ponderous rhythm, the mountain bull, a territorial beast known for its unpredictable aggression. Mason scanned the darkness, his breathing steady, but the beast remained hidden, visible only through the quiver of leaves disturbed in its wake. He weighed his options. The sacred law forbade leaving the wilderness trail early or seeking shelter outside the land's natural formations. If the bull charged, he would have to rely on instinct and terrain to survive. He steadied his stance and extinguished the remnants of his fire, plunging the clearing into deeper blackness. Flames, however faint, would only draw the creature nearer. Moments stretched into minutes, the tremors rising and falling unpredictably. Then, as suddenly as they had begun, the quakes diminished, fading back into the forest's vast expanse. The mountain bull had lost interest, or perhaps had been testing the boundaries of the trial. Mason returned to the base of the oak tree, but sleep remained a distant possibility. The wilderness had shown him one of its many faces, a warning that it would not grant him rest without cost. When the first hint of dawn finally slipped across the treetops, the valley breathed again. The sounds of rustling leaves, distant birds, and trickling water replaced the oppressive silence of the night. Mason rose with a sense of renewed determination. The Black Feather trial was not solely about surviving physical danger. It required maintaining focus when fatigue and fear eroded clarity. He gathered his belongings and moved deeper into the wilderness. The valley stretched endlessly before him, winding through narrow passes and thick undergrowth. The morning air carried the scent of wet earth and pine, grounding him as he trekked further from the Rowan homestead. Hours passed before he encountered his next challenge. A steep ravine cut across his path, its edges lined with loose rock and dry soil. The descent was treacherous, but the valley demanded navigation without avoidance. Mason tested the ground with each step, relying on balance and patience. The sun had reached its peak by the time he reached the bottom, but the heat pooled in the ravine, turning the air thick and stifling. It was here that the valley introduced its cruelest obstacle. Not a beast or a storm, but thirst. The canteen he carried held only a quarter of its original contents. The trial forbade seeking water unless the valley provided it naturally, and the ravine showed no sign of streams or pools. As sweat gathered along his brow and his breathing grew shallow, Mason pressed forward along the ravine floor, searching for any hint of moisture. The hours inched on, each one heavier than the last. The ravine stretched far beyond what Mason had anticipated. Heat shimmered across the layered stone, and fatigue crept through his limbs. Yet he pushed onward, drawing strength from the memory of the Rowan sisters, of the life he hoped to build beyond the trials. He had come too far to abandon his purpose now. Eventually, he spotted a narrow gap in the ravine wall, marked by damp moss and the faint glimmer of water trickling from above. Relief washed through him, but it was tempered by caution. Water sources in the valley often attracted predators. He approached slowly, listening for signs of danger. The only sound was the gentle drip of water. He knelt and drank sparingly, resisting the urge to indulge fully. The valley punished excess as severely as weakness. After quenching his thirst, he refilled his canteen and climbed through the narrow passage toward higher ground. By late afternoon, he emerged into an open clearing marked by tall grass and a cluster of wildflowers. The sky stretched wide overhead, clouds drifting lazily across its expanse. Mason rested briefly, drawing strength from the serenity of the landscape. But the valley was not finished with him yet. A sharp crack echoed through the clearing, followed by the rustle of disturbed grass. Mason's senses sharpened immediately. The sound was too heavy for a small animal and too deliberate for wind. The valley had tested his endurance, then his survival instincts. Now it tested his vigilance. A shadow moved along the edge of the clearing, too quick to identify, but unmistakably a predator. Mason remained still, recognizing that sudden movement would provoke an attack. The creature circled, its silhouette barely visible through the tall grass. It moved with fluid precision, each step measured and silent. A wildcat, perhaps, a creature known for striking without warning. Mason waited. The valley held its breath, but instead of attacking, the predator stopped at the edge of the clearing, paused as though assessing him, and then slipped back into the wilderness. It had tested his composure and deemed him worthy to proceed. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Mason made his way toward the eastern ridge, the final boundary of the Black Feather Trail. The terrain softened as he approached, the trees thinning and the valley's familiar landscape stretching invitingly ahead. The completion of the trail was near. When he reached the ridge, he paused, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over him. The valley had tested him with darkness, fear, thirst, exhaustion, and uncertainty. It had stripped him down to the core of who he was, and found him willing to endure. The black feather lay warm in his palm, a symbol of the first trial completed, but endurance was only the beginning. Ahead lay the trials of loyalty and truth, challenges that would test not his survival, but the depth of his heart and the sincerity of his intentions. As darkness crept once more across Ash Creek Valley, Mason began the long walk back toward the Rowan homestead, knowing the sisters were waiting, and that the next trial would cut far deeper than first. The path back toward the Rowan homestead stretched long beneath the fading sky, painted in hues of amber and muted rose as dusk settled across Ash Creek Valley. Mason's heart moved with a weary steadiness, every step marked by the weight of survival. The black feather rested safely in his satchel, a quiet reminder that he had endured the first of the sacred law's tests. Yet the valley, with all its dangers and beauty, had been only the beginning. What waited ahead would pierce deeper, cutting into his resolve and measuring the truth of what he carried within. The Rowan sisters awaited his return long before he reached the homestead. Their silhouettes stood at the edge of the corral, framed by lantern glow and drifting dust. They remained still and unreadable, observing the man who approached with exhaustion in his stride but fire in his eyes. The wilderness had marked him, but it had not broken him. That alone was enough to warrant the next stage. As Mason crossed the boundary of the homestead, the sisters guided him silently toward the main hall. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Everything they needed to know was carried in the way he held himself, in the absence of fear, in the presence of determination. Inside the hall, the 3 sacred feathers rested upon the wooden table where the trials had first begun. The brown feather sat at the center, its rough edges illuminated by flickering candlelight. It represented loyalty, not the simple loyalty of companionship, but the fierce, unbroken loyalty required to protect a family, a legacy, and a future. The second trial would not take place in the wilderness. It would unfold on the Rowan land itself, where threats lurked not in shadows of trees, but in the hearts of men who hungered for power, wealth, or vengeance. The Rowan homestead had many enemies, and Mason's task was not simply to defend it, but to demonstrate the unwavering devotion the sacred law demanded. The trial began with the setting of the sun. Mason was given no rest. Instead, he was led to the eastern ridge overlooking the expanse of the ranch, where the terrain dipped into rolling fields and patches of distant forest. Lanterns flickered along the boundary fences, casting long, wavering shadows across the earth. The night air carried the distant howl of wolves and the rustle of wind through grass. But beneath those natural sounds, Mason detected something else. Ominous, almost imperceptible. A quiet too heavy, too purposeful, suggesting the valley was holding its breath for what would come next. The Rowan sisters left him there, his task understood: protect the homestead through the night. Any threat, any disturbance, any predator or intruder, human or otherwise, would become part of the test. The sisters had faced such dangers countless times. Now Mason would stand in their place. The first hours passed uneventfully. The moon climbed into the sky, washing the land in pale silver. Mason moved along the fence line, his boots sinking softly into the soil. The ranch horses grazed nearby, their movements slow and unconcerned, unaware of the tension stretching across the land. For a moment the night seemed peaceful, almost serene, but the valley did not allow peace for long. A distant crack echoed from the northern ridge, too sharp to be natural, too heavy to be dismissed. Mason shifted his stance, listening intently. Another crack followed, then the faint creak of wood bending under pressure. Something, or someone, was testing the boundary fences. He moved swiftly across the field, weaving between grazing horses and scattered brush. As he climbed the gradual incline toward the northern ridge, the sounds grew clearer. The fence posts trembled under impact. Something was ramming them from the opposite side. Mason crouched low, observing from the shadows. A pair of wild mustangs stood at the far edge of the fence, stamping the ground and charging the barrier. The animals were not acting out of instinct. Something had spooked them, driving them into a frenzy. Their powerful bodies crashed against the wood, threatening to break through and stampede into the homestead. Mason reacted quickly. He grabbed a loose length of rope from a nearby post and advanced with measured steps, keeping himself angled to avoid startling the animals further. He guided his movements with patience, letting his presence be felt without threatening their space. Slowly, he eased the mustangs away from the fence, maneuvering them back toward the open plains. The animals snorted, agitated, but eventually retreated. He inspected the fence. Several posts were cracked, weakened by the impact. If left unattended, they would break under the slightest pressure. Mason reinforced the posts with available timber, securing the weakened sections with rope and steady hands. The work was difficult under moonlight, but he persisted, driven by the knowledge that the homestead's safety depended on vigilance. But the trial was far from over. As he finished securing the final post, movement caught the corner of his eye. A flicker of light, unnatural, deliberate, glowed near the western field. The glow danced like a flame, bright against the darkness. Mason's chest tightened. Fire was the most devastating weapon an enemy could use against a ranch as vast and dry as the Rowan land. He sprinted across the field, boots pounding against the earth. The wind carried the scent of smoke long before he reached the western boundary. A small blaze burned at the base of a haystack, rising quickly, threatening to leap onto the stacked bundles beside it. The flames crackled hungrily, eager to spread. Mason wasted no time. He smothered the fire with a burlap cloth left near the barn, beating down the flames until they collapsed into smoldering embers. The fire died, but the danger remained. Someone had set it intentionally. He scanned the area. The shadows cloaking the fields felt heavier than before, as though hiding eyes that watched him from just beyond the reach of lantern light. The homestead had enemies, and the trial of the brown feather demanded that Mason face them without retreat. The night pressed on relentlessly. Hours passed as he patrolled the land, reinforcing vulnerable areas, listening for disturbances, tracking faint movements that slipped through the grass like whispers. He felt the weight of exhaustion settle into his muscles, yet he forced himself onward. Loyalty was more than a promise. It was endurance in the face of threats that sought to wear a person down. Near midnight, a sudden clatter echoed from the southern corral. Mason rushed toward the sound. A shadowy figure darted away from the fencing and disappeared into the tree line. Mason pursued, though the darkness slowed his steps. The intruder moved too quickly to identify, yet the message was clear. Someone intended to test the security of the homestead. Whether a thief seeking livestock or a rival ranch hand with a vendetta, the threat was real. Returning to the corral, Mason discovered the rope latch had been partially cut. One more strike of a blade, and the corral gate would have swung open, releasing dozens of cattle into the night. The chaos would have been devastating. He reinforced the latch, ensuring no future tampering would succeed. By the time the moon began its descent and the first hints of dawn touched the sky, Mason had faced predators, saboteurs, natural dangers, and orchestrated threats. The homestead stood intact, protected through his vigilance. When he returned to the main yard at sunrise, the Rowan sisters were waiting. Their expressions betrayed nothing, but the flicker of acknowledgment in their eyes spoke volumes. Mason had endured the night. He had defended their land with unwavering determination. He had earned the brown feather. But as the trial concluded, a new tension settled across the valley, one tied not to danger from outside, but to truths buried within. Ahead lay the white feather, the trial of truth, the trial that would force Mason to face the ghosts he had carried for years. The storm that had shaken the mountains throughout the night faded by dawn, leaving behind a pale gold sky streaked with quiet clouds. The land seemed newly washed, raw earth glistening, the scent of wet cedar rising like incense, and the wind moving with a gentleness that felt deceptive, as if it knew more trials waited ahead. For Cole Thatcher, the world's sudden calm felt almost cruel. He stood at the edge of the cliff where the second sister had departed, a man carrying the weight of wounds that had not yet healed and truths he had never wanted to learn. He had fulfilled the trial of strength demanded by the eldest sister, and he had endured the trial of loyalty set by the second. Each had pushed him deeper into the shadowed corners of his own soul. Now only one sister remained the hardest to read, the one whose presence the others had hinted at with unease rather than explanation. The youngest sister loved him, but the path to her required facing all three guardians of the sacred law. And though Cole had survived so far, he knew instinctively that the most dangerous test was yet ahead. The third sister's name was whispered across ranchlands and border towns, often with a mixture of reverence and unease: Saren Holloway, the Sister of Shadows. She lived beyond the canyon in a place few dared to tread, for rumor said she walked with spirits, saw futures, and carried a grief so deep that it had carved her into something more myth than woman. If the eldest sister was strength, and the second was honor, then Saren was the one who guarded the heart, the hidden pieces of truth that could make or break a man. Cole saddled his horse with slow, deliberate movements, each buckle tightened through pain. His back was lined with bruises from the avalanche, his arms scarred from gripping jagged stone, and the memory of holding the second sister's life in his hands still thrummed through him. But he pushed forward, because love, not the soft kind, but the kind that demanded sacrifice, pulled him onward. And because the youngest sister's face, luminous with hope, lived behind every thought he had, he rode away from the cliffs just as the first light spread across the valley. The trail dipped into a landscape grown wilder with each mile. Pines rose higher, shadows deepened, and the silence thickened with an almost living presence. Cole felt watched, not by animals, but by something older, something that tested him long before Saren Holloway would appear. Hours passed, the sun climbed, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the path narrowed to a ravine carved by centuries of wind. Cole dismounted when the ground grew too steep and led his horse by the reins. The air shifted. A subtle tremor in the earth made him pause. There, ahead, where the canyon twisted, a lone figure waited. She did not approach him. She did not speak. She simply stood, cloaked in dusk, colored fabric despite the daylight, her eyes dark enough to unsettle even the bravest. Saren Holloway was unlike her sisters. Where the eldest radiated power and the second radiated pride, Saren seemed surrounded by an aura of quiet that felt deeper than silence. Her face was strong, yet marked with a sorrow Cole could not identify, as if she had carried the weight of too many secrets for too long. He stopped several paces away. She turned her gaze toward him with a slow, deliberate movement, studying him with a stillness that made time itself pause. And though she said nothing, he understood that she had been waiting for him long before he ever began this journey. She lifted a hand, not in welcome, but in instruction, directing him deeper into the canyon. So began the third trial. Cole followed her into the narrowing stone corridor. The world seemed to dim, though no clouds crossed the sun. The canyon walls rose so high they swallowed sound. Even his footsteps felt strange, too soft, too distant. Saren moved ahead of him like a shadow given form, never quite touching the light, never allowing him to come too close. Eventually she stopped in a small open space, where the stone walls widened into an alcove carved by nature. A pool of water sat at its center, so still it resembled glass. The air here was cooler, almost cold. Cole's breath fogged slightly as he entered. Saren finally turned toward him, and though her lips never parted, something pressed into his mind, a silent message formed not from words but from feeling. The trial of truth. He understood then that this sister spoke in ways that transcended voice. She was the keeper of unseen things, of internal reckonings. She stepped aside and gestured toward the pool. Cole approached it with caution. The water was impossibly clear, showing every stone, every branch beneath its surface. But when he knelt beside it, his reflection did not appear. Instead, he saw visions, echoes of choices he had made, regrets he carried, and wounds he thought long buried. He saw his past, the ranch fire that had taken his family, the responsibility he blamed himself for, the years of wandering in search of purpose, and the hollow loneliness that had shaped him more than he admitted. He saw the youngest sister's face, full of trust, and the fear he had never voiced that he might not be enough for her, that love alone might not heal what was broken inside him. The pool shifted again. Now it showed possible futures, some dark, some bright. Futures in which he failed the trials, futures in which he walked away out of fear, futures where his love endured, but brought her pain because he had never faced the truth of who he truly was. Saren watched him with unwavering intensity, demanding that he confront it all. Hours seemed to pass as Cole sat before the pool. His heart ached, his breath shook. He saw things that broke him, things that humbled him, things he wished he could forget. And the deeper he looked, the more he understood the true nature of the trial. It was not about proving himself to the sisters. It was about proving himself to himself, and that, in all his battles, injuries, and sacrifices, was the hardest task he had ever faced. Eventually, the visions faded, replaced by the stillness of the water. Cole rose slowly, feeling lighter yet more aware of the fragility within him. Saren stepped toward him, her presence both grounding and unsettling. She studied him again, and something in her expression softened. A faint shift, perhaps approval, perhaps understanding. Without a word, she placed her hand over her heart, then extended it toward the northern trail beyond the alcove. The gesture was clear. He had passed. The path now opened toward the final stage, one that lay beyond the sisters, beyond the sacred law, in a place where the truth he had embraced must be carried into action. Cole nodded once, the weight in his chest replaced by resolve. He mounted his horse as Saren watched, silent as a shadow, ancient as the canyon. And as he rode toward the final leg of his journey, the wind rose again, whispering of trials finished and trials yet to come. The story was not over. Love had not yet been earned in full, and destiny waited just beyond the horizon. The northern trail opened into a valley unlike any Cole Thatcher had crossed before. Its land stretched wide and empty, an ocean of pale grass rippling beneath the wind. The horizon glowed red with the nearing sunset, casting the world in a hue that made everything appear suspended between reality and memory. This was the place the sacred law marked as the end of a man's proving, a land untouched even by rumor, where only those who had passed the trials were allowed to walk. Cole rode forward with the quiet determination of a man carrying both the weight of his past and the strength of what he had become. The bruises earned in the first trial still ached beneath his shirt. The cuts from the avalanche stung whenever the wind struck them. The emotional churning of the trial of truth lingered inside him like a storm's echo, yet none of it slowed his pace now. He had faced the three sisters, confronted every shadow in his soul, and still the fire within him had not dimmed. All that remained was the final vow, a vow that could only be spoken before the youngest sister herself. She lived beyond a cluster of stone pillars that rose from the earth like ancient monuments. It was said the valley carried the final decision of fate, binding a man's heart to his promises in ways that could not be broken. And though the sacred law offered a path forward, it also allowed the sisters to intervene if the man failed at the end. Cole passed between the pillars, each one marked with carvings so old they had been softened by time. The air thickened, filled with both stillness and anticipation. He could feel eyes upon him, perhaps spirits of the valley, perhaps memories of those who had attempted the trials before him. Some had succeeded, many had not. Their stories clung to the stone like dust. Then at last he saw her. The youngest sister stood near a lone cottonwood tree, whose branches swayed gently despite the still air. Her dress fluttered around her boots, and her hair caught the fading sunlight, turning strands of it molten gold. She was the same woman he had fallen in love with long before this journey began, yet she seemed changed stronger, grounded in the certainty that came from knowing her sisters had done all they could to protect her. Cole dismounted and walked toward her slowly, aware of every heartbeat. The valley around them seemed to quiet further, as if the land itself recognized the weight of the moment. This was not just a meeting of two hearts. It was the conclusion of a tradition older than any frontier town, older than the guns-scarred history of the Wild West itself. She stepped toward him, stopping only when a breath of space remained between them. No words passed between them, for the sacred law required silence until the vow began. Instead, the communication lay in the eyes and the gratitude shining in hers, and in the raw honesty now visible in his. Behind her, three silhouettes appeared at the top of the hill overlooking the valley. The sisters had returned, each one watching with the intensity of guardians whose duties were nearly complete. The eldest stood with arms crossed, her posture both protective and proud. The second held herself with the poise of a woman who understood honor more deeply than most. The third, the sister of shadows, observed with the unreadable calm of someone who had glimpsed the truth of his soul and found it sufficient. The youngest sister placed her hand over her heart. The gesture marked the beginning of the final vow. Cole inhaled, the air dry and cold but welcome in his lungs. He stepped closer, stopping only when the sacred law allowed no more distance between them. And though he could not speak until the vow began, something inside him aligned, a sense that every trial, every wound, every revelation had led him here. The final vow required more than strength, more than loyalty, more than truth. It required commitment to a future unwritten, a promise shaped by courage and steadiness rather than passion alone. As she lowered her hand, the wind changed direction. The time had come. The valley grew utterly silent, as though nature itself waited for the vow to seal their fate. Cole began the vow, not in spoken words, but in the actions demanded by the sacred law. He knelt before the youngest sister, head bowed, accepting the humility that came with offering his heart fully. Then he removed the leather band from his wrist, a simple piece of braided hide that he had worn since boyhood. It was one of the few things that had survived the ranch fire that had taken his family. It represented everything he had lost and everything he had become. He placed the band at her feet, the gesture symbolizing the surrender of his past to the life he wished to build with her. When he lifted his gaze, she gently retrieved the leather band and closed her hands around it. The sisters on the ridge watched in silence, seeing his sincerity without need for explanation. Then came her part of the vow. She reached behind her and unfastened a small necklace carved from bone, something she had carried since childhood. Imbued with memories and meaning no outsider would ever fully understand. She knelt before him in return, placing the necklace into his hands. In doing so, she entrusted him with her future. The sacred law required equal exchange, the past for the future, the old life for the new. For a long moment they remained kneeling, facing one another, the symbols of their vows resting in their palms. The red sun dipped low, painting the valley in a final blaze of color, and in that radiance the air shifted once more. The sisters descended the hill. The eldest approached first, her boots pressing firm imprints into the dirt. She examined the leather band, then the bone necklace, then the man who held them both. After a moment of weighed silence, she placed her hand on Cole's shoulder, a gesture of acceptance, one she did not offer lightly. This was her affirmation that he had passed the trial of strength, not by force, but by endurance. The second sister approached next. Her gaze was sharp, but in it lay a spark of respect. She nodded once, recognizing that he had upheld honor not just toward her, but toward all of them. And in that nod, she acknowledged that he had passed the trial of loyalty. Finally, the third sister stepped forward, her presence altering the air with its quiet gravity. She looked deeply into Cole's eyes, searching once more for any shadow he had not faced. Whatever she saw, it satisfied her. She touched the bone necklace in his hands lightly, sealing the truth he had embraced during her trial. Only then did she step back. The valley seemed to exhale. The sisters formed a circle around the youngest, joining their hands upon her shoulders. She stepped forward, now carrying the weight of tradition, family, and her own heart. With the soft rustling of grass beneath her feet, she closed the final distance between them and placed the leather band back onto his wrist. It fit as though it had always belonged there, transformed now by meaning far greater than its material form. He then placed the bone necklace around her neck, lifting the strand with hands steady despite the emotion surging through him. As the necklace touched her skin, a breeze swept through the valley, warm and sudden, bending grass and stirring dust in spirals around them. The sacred law had been completed. The sisters watched as the two stood side by side, not as a test, not as a trial, but as a union recognized by tradition older than any frontier. The sun dipped below the horizon, the sky faded to deep violet, and with the day's end came the beginning of something new. The youngest sister reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally, with a certainty forged in fire, stone, honesty, and heart. Behind them, the sisters began their walk back toward the distant ridge, knowing their duty had ended. The valley no longer felt heavy with expectation. Instead, it buzzed with possibility. Cole Thatcher had not only earned the right to stand beside the woman he loved, he had earned the right to build a future with her, one rooted in the unbreakable bond forged through the sacred law. As night settled over the valley and stars began to bloom across the sky, Cole led her toward the trail where his horse waited. The past lay behind them, the trials were complete, and the stories whispered across the Wild West would forever carry the tale of the cowboy who faced sisters, trials, and shadows, not for glory, but for love. Their journey forward had only just begun.